Devin McRae had spent 37 years fixing other people's problems. As the owner of a modest but reliable auto repair shop in northern Texas, he'd built his reputation on being the man who always knew what was wrong under the hood, whether that meant a leaky gasket, a temperamental alternator, or a client trying to haggle over a job they couldn't even name. He wasn't flashy, wasn't particularly talkative, and never bothered with advertising. People just knew him. If your car died on the highway, you hoped you were within towing distance of McRae's. That reputation hadn't made him rich, but it gave him something he valued more: freedom. So when he sold the business at 63, not because he had to, but because he was done, he chose a place where no one knew his name: the desert. A small, quiet town in Arizona where the heat dried everything to the bone and the neighbors didn't ask questions unless you invited them to. The house wasn't fancy: single-story, beige stucco, and a garage big enough for 2 trucks. But it sat on land he owned outright, with a short gravel driveway and a crooked mailbox that leaned like it was always listening. It was peace, finally. The first month in that house was uneventful, and that's exactly what Devin wanted. He mowed the small patch of front lawn once, then decided to cover it in crushed stone. He installed blackout blinds in every room and left most of the furniture unpacked, preferring to live with just what he needed: a firm bed, a leather recliner, a steel-top kitchen table. The only luxury he allowed himself was the coffee, imported, bitter, and strong enough to jolt his spine. He made a habit of rising just after 5, brewing a cup, sitting on the back patio, and watching the sun smother the stars as it rose behind the hills. There was no noise out there, just the hum of cicadas and the occasional coyote yipping in the distance. The silence was sacred. No customers, no invoices, no arguing with suppliers, no family asking when he'd finally slow down. He had slowed down. Completely. So when the envelope arrived, thick, embossed, and stamped with the name of a national bank he'd never dealt with, Devin noticed. He didn't open it right away. He left it on the counter, unopened for hours, instinct gnawing at the edges of his calm. It didn't look like junk. The envelope was too formal, the address too exact. His full name was typed with precision, and the paper had the smell of something official. That night, after dinner, he opened it with the same deliberateness he used to dismantle carburetors. Slowly, carefully, eyes already scanning for what didn't belong. The letter was titled, "Notice of Payment Default. Foreclosure Proceedings Pending." Devin's eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in a cold, mechanical shift. He read every line twice, then a third time. The letter informed him that a property loan in the amount of $200,000 had gone unpaid for 3 consecutive months. The borrower was now in violation of the loan agreement. If payment was not received within 21 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. The address listed under the loan was his street, his city, his zip code. The name, however, was not. The borrower's name read Karen Jacoby. Devin stared at the paper without blinking. His first reaction wasn't panic, it was assessment. What was this? A clerical error? A scam? He flipped the page and examined the footer. Real letterhead. Real loan officer name. Real contact number. No typos. No obvious red flags. He looked again at the envelope. The postage wasn't bulk rate. It had been mailed first class, individually. He walked to his desk, pulled out a locked drawer, and retrieved the file containing all of his property documents. The deed, the county records, the sale confirmation, all in his name, clean and uncontested. He had paid in full. No mortgage. No lines. Nothing. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in his recliner with a notepad and started listing everything he needed to do. Contact the bank, review property tax filings, check with the county assessor, request a copy of the loan application. He also added a note to freeze his credit. If someone had used his address for a loan, they might have used his name next. The next morning, he called the number listed on the letter. The woman who answered had a tone like she was used to panicked voices. Devin was calm. He explained that he had received a notice about a foreclosure on a loan he never took out, for a name he didn't recognize, but connected to his residential address. She asked for the case number, and he read it to her. There was a pause. Then her tone shifted, slightly more guarded. "Mr. McRae, this loan is indeed tied to your property address. However, the borrower's name does not match your file. It could be a mailing error." "No," Devin said. "It's not a mailing error. The notice says foreclosure proceedings are going to be filed on a property registered at my address." "I see," she said. "In that case, I'll escalate this to our internal legal team." "May I place you on a brief hold?" Devin sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. When she returned, she said, "I've sent this up for internal verification. You should receive a formal reply within 7 to 10 business days." "I want a copy of the loan application," he said. "I'm afraid I can't send that without a subpoena or direct involvement in the loan," she replied. "I'm directly involved," Devin said. "You're threatening to foreclose on my property. Technically, the loan is attached to the address, not your name, but I understand your concern." It was a dead end. Devin hung up and added another note to his list. Find a lawyer. But before that, he needed to know more about this Karen Jacoby. He opened his laptop and searched the name, narrowing by city and county. A few hits. One was a recent tax filing connected to a trust under the same name. Another was a social media profile, private, but with a smiling photo of a middle-aged woman wearing designer sunglasses in front of a beige house. The background looked familiar, too familiar. He stared at it for a few seconds before realizing why. The house behind her was identical to his. Not similar, identical. The same sagging fence on the left, the same rusted shed behind the tree. The photo had been taken from his own property. He felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a clerical error. Someone had physically stood on his land and taken a photo to use in whatever documentation they had submitted. He walked out to the spot where the photo had likely been taken and looked around. He saw no one, but the realization sank in heavy and slow. Someone had been here, maybe more than once. Maybe they had walked his property lines. Maybe they had accessed public records and attached his address to some alternate version of reality where his home belonged to them. It was mid-afternoon by then. The sun was harsh and dry. He went back inside and poured a glass of water. His hands didn't shake, but they felt slower. He wasn't scared. He was angry. Someone had used his property in a real estate fraud, and the system was already in motion to tear his ownership apart unless he stopped it. He needed a lawyer. Not tomorrow. Today. He went to the filing cabinet and pulled out the business card of a local attorney he'd met at a community zoning meeting 3 weeks prior. The man had seemed competent, polite but sharp. He dialed the number and left a message. "Name's Devin McRae. I've got a situation involving fraudulent use of my property in a home loan. I need to stop a foreclosure that's coming to my address over a loan I never signed. Call me back before the end of the day if you can." Then he sat back in the chair and waited, not just for the call, but for the next shot in a battle he hadn't chosen, but damn well intended to win. By the following morning, Devin had received a call back from the attorney, a man named Glenn Richter, who spoke with the calm assurance of someone who'd spent years untangling the lies of bureaucracy and knew exactly how long it would take. Glenn asked for the details, and Devin gave them, all of them. The notice, the loan, the name Karen Jacoby, the bank's refusal to send documentation without a subpoena, and the photo that matched his property to the one used in a public profile. Glenn didn't interrupt. When Devin finished, Glenn's voice was low and clipped. "Meet me in my office. Bring everything. This isn't just fraud, it's coordination." Devin arrived 20 minutes early. Glenn's office was modest, nothing like the polished, sterile corporate rooms you'd expect from someone with a specialty in property law. It smelled faintly of old leather and toner. Papers were organized, but the walls were lined with thick books, codes, real cases, not diplomas. Glenn didn't make small talk. He motioned Devin to sit and held out his hand for the letter. After reading it slowly, he leaned back and said, "This isn't some Nigerian prince scam. This is someone who understands the financing process well enough to tie your property into a legitimate mortgage contract, which means they used either public records or someone inside a system." Devin nodded. The bank already started the default countdown. Glenn said, "That's standard. Once the system flags non-payment, foreclosure notices go out automatically. You could be in possession of the house with a clean title and they'd still come for it if the back end says it's tied to unpaid debt. It doesn't make it legal, but it means they won't stop unless someone puts pressure on the process." He opened a folder and began writing. "First, we're filing a formal cease and desist against the bank, informing them of potential fraud tied to the loan. That'll buy us some time, at least 15 business days. I'll also issue a demand for documentation under threat of litigation. We're not asking, we're warning." Devin asked, "Can you find out how they got my address in the first place?" Glenn glanced up. "That'll come later. First we stop the bleeding, then we trace the wound." The deeper you dig in cases like this, the more you realize people think if they keep everything digital, it's untouchable. But records don't fake themselves. Someone submitted something: utilities, property usage, residency claims, using your land. Glenn's assistant, a sharp woman named Cora, began compiling a packet to submit to the county recorder, requesting a freeze on all property-related updates tied to Devin's parcel number. Devin watched the process quietly. He felt like a man watching surgeons patch him up while knowing he was about to step back into gunfire. As he left the office, Glenn told him, "If this was a one-off mistake, we'll know soon enough. If not, someone's got a lot more to lose than you do, and that's good." That night, Devin sat on his porch, a legal pad in his lap, listing every change he'd made to the property since he moved in. Not because it mattered to the case, but because it reminded him that the house was his. He remembered the day he installed the motion sensor over the garage, how the wiring had been finicky, and he'd fixed it himself because he didn't trust the contractor's apprentice. He remembered pulling out the broken mailbox post with a crowbar and sinking a new one in concrete, even though the neighbors told him no one cared. He cared. Every nail, every patch of paint, every load of gravel on the driveway was part of his life now. That's what they were threatening. Not money, ownership, and they hadn't even bothered to knock. The next morning, a thick envelope from Glenn arrived at Devin's door, along with an email from the legal assistant containing digital copies of all filings. Devin read through the notice of dispute and the injunction request, each word sharpened like a weapon. Attached was a draft affidavit for him to sign, declaring under penalty of perjury that he had no knowledge of the loan, did not authorize it, had not given permission for his address to be used, and had no relationship with Karen Jacoby. Devin signed it without hesitation. 2 days later, something new happened. A man appeared in front of Devin's house in a gray sedan, unmarked with rental plates. He stepped out slowly, holding a clipboard. Devin didn't go outside. He watched through the blinds. The man walked along the perimeter of the property, taking photographs. Not casually, methodically, front elevation, side angles, street view. Then he walked back to the car and placed something in the mailbox. Devin waited until the car disappeared down the road before stepping out. In the box was a second letter from the bank, this one labeled Pre-Foreclosure Property Evaluation, Do Not Remove. Devin took it out anyway. He stood there, sunlight burning his neck, holding a piece of paper that described his home as an asset of pending reassessment. They had come to inventory his life like it was a pawned watch. That evening, he called Glenn again. Glenn said, They're not listening. We're taking it to court. I'll file a temporary restraining order in the morning. We'll drag the records in front of a judge if we have to." Devin said, "Can we force them to show where the loan's paperwork came from?" Glenn replied, "Once we're in court, yes. But you need to understand, banks outsource this stuff. They use third-party mortgage originators, and those guys don't follow the same rules. If the fraud started there, it'll take subpoenas to get the full picture." Devin paused. "Then start writing them." The next morning, the sheriff's office knocked, not for Devin, but for a wellness check. A concerned party had submitted a complaint that the man living at his address was showing signs of mental confusion and erratic behavior. Devin opened the door with steady eyes. "Officer," he said, "would you like to see the paperwork from my attorney about a fraudulent loan using my house as collateral? Or the court documents filed yesterday against a bank trying to take my property?" The officer, young and visibly uncomfortable, said, "Sir, this is just a wellness check. We're not here for anything criminal." Devin replied, "Then I suggest you file your report as stable, competent, and extremely irritated." The officer nodded and left. Glenn called 30 minutes later, already knowing. "They're trying to build a paper trail against you. If they can't take your house legally, they'll try to frame you as unstable. It's not new. It's disgusting, but it's not new." Devin leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling fan, letting it spin without purpose. He wasn't afraid. He was locked in. And someone out there was going to regret ever typing his address into a form. The next week unfolded like a tightening noose. Devin started noticing subtle shifts that were easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. First, it was the letter carrier, no longer the same guy who had been delivering for the past 2 months. The new one barely glanced up when Devin stood outside during his routine morning coffee, dropping off mail with the kind of detached speed that signaled a recent reroute. Devin didn't trust that. He began checking the mailbox more frequently, twice a day, documenting every piece of mail, taking photographs of envelopes addressed to names other than his. By Friday, there were 4 addressed to Karen Jacoby, 2 bank statements, 1 postcard from a real estate agent, and 1 letter from a law office he didn't recognize. Devin didn't open any of them. He took them directly to Glenn. The attorney's reaction was immediate. "They're trying to build a residency," Glenn said. "Whoever she is or whoever's behind her is using your address to establish a paper trail. If enough pieces exist that suggest someone named Karen has lived here or received mail here, it muddies the water in court. They're trying to create a foundation of confusion." Devin asked, "Even if I've lived here the whole time?" Glenn nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter. If it gets ugly enough, a judge could delay a decision until those claims are sorted out, which gives the bank room to continue proceedings under a cloud of ambiguity. That's what they want. Delay is leverage. Confusion is protection." Devin's response was simple. "Then let's cut through it." Glenn responded by submitting a notarized affidavit, not just from Devin, but from the former owner of the house who confirmed the sale was clean and final with no secondary residents or legal occupants. Glenn also filed a formal complaint with the Postal Inspector's Office, requesting a fraud investigation into misdirected and unauthorized use of a residential mailbox. That gave them leverage. A small one, but enough to formally challenge the authenticity of the documents being used by the loan originator. Glenn's paralegal discovered that the loan had been issued through a third-party mortgage aggregator, a group that didn't actually hold the loans but packaged them to resell to banks. That trail led to an entity in Nevada with no real office and a disconnected number. A shell. Devin wasn't surprised. That Saturday, a car showed up again. Not the same gray sedan as before. This one was black, newer, and parked across the street for over 20 minutes without anyone stepping out. Devin didn't confront them. He just noted the time, took down the license plate, and called Glenn. On Monday, Glenn filed for emergency injunctive relief, asking the judge to freeze all foreclosure-related actions tied to Devon's address and to compel the bank to produce all documents used in the approval of the original loan. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. Until then, Devon had to keep the pressure up without stepping outside the law. He installed a second camera, hidden this time, facing the street. Not because he was paranoid, but because he understood one truth. People backed off when they knew they were being watched, but they made mistakes when they thought they weren't. 3 days before the hearing, Devon received a phone call. The number was blocked. He usually ignored those, but something in his gut told him to pick up. A woman's voice, calm, practiced, rehearsed. "Mr. McRae, this is a courtesy call. You may not know me, but I've been involved in some of the processes regarding the property on Echo Ridge Road. I just want you to know we never intended for this to cause you distress." Devon didn't respond. The voice continued. "Sometimes the systems we work within don't give us the clearest picture. We act based on information we're given, but we also know when it's time to walk away. If you're willing to let this go, stop the filings, dismiss the lawyer, we're prepared to settle this quietly. No harm done, even some compensation, if that's of interest to you." Devon's silence stretched. Then, with perfect clarity, he said, "Lady, I don't know what kind of people think you are, but you came for the wrong house." He hung up. The number never worked again. But that same evening, someone left a manila envelope at his door. No name, no return address. Inside was a stack of property photographs, including one of his back fence, one of his garage's side entrance, and, most disturbing of all, one of him sitting on his back porch, drinking coffee. It wasn't recent. The lighting suggested early morning, and he was wearing the red flannel he had put away a week ago. But it was enough to cross a line. This wasn't just about fraud anymore. It was pressure. Glenn responded by immediately alerting the court and attaching the incident to the emergency filing. He also contacted a private investigator, not to chase down the people involved, but to document any and all contact Devon received over the next few weeks. If this was going to court, it would go in complete. Devon, meanwhile, began calling the county recorder's office directly, every day, asking for status updates on the parcel freeze. He wasn't rude, just persistent. The clerk eventually said, "You're good at this. Most people give up after 2 calls." Devon replied, "I don't give up when people try to steal my house." That same week, the paralegal found something strange. A filing had been added to the property record 2 months prior, listing Jacoby LLC as a non-owner interest in the address, under a designation used for income tracking on rental properties. Someone had filed that form, claiming that the home was part of a real estate holding company. It didn't transfer ownership, but it planted a flag. Devon stared at the document, rage simmering just beneath the surface. They weren't just faking a loan, they were retroactively claiming his house had been part of a real estate portfolio. Glenn said, "This is bigger than identity fraud. This is title fraud layered on investment fraud. They're using a shell LLC to assert rights they never earned, probably in hopes of flipping the paper to a cash buyer." Devon asked, "So we hit them on both ends?" Glenn nodded, hard. By the time the court date arrived, Glenn had a binder of exhibits 2 inches thick. Devon showed up wearing his work boots and a pressed shirt. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man ready to end this. The judge was sharp and old school, the kind that didn't like paperwork without people behind it. When Glenn laid out the pattern, the false mail, the third-party loan, the title misrepresentation, the attempted coercion, and the threats, the judge turned to the bank's representative and asked one question. "Do you believe this man, sitting in front of me, is part of this loan agreement?" The lawyer mumbled something about technical errors and procedural confusion. The judge slammed the gavel once. "Injunction granted, all activity suspended. And you'll deliver full documentation to opposing counsel within 5 business days. Or I'll personally order a motion to compel with sanctions." Outside the courtroom, Glenn smiled for the first time since this started. "We're in," he said. "Now let's make them bleed." Devin just nodded. He wasn't interested in revenge, but he sure as hell wanted accountability. And he was only getting started. The morning after the injunction was granted, Devin drove out to Glenn's office with 2 black binders under his arm. One filled with every legal document Glenn's team had generated since the beginning of the case, the other containing Devin's own logbook meticulously kept. Inside were dates, times, names of clerks, registration numbers, tracking IDs from the Postal Service, even the serial numbers of each camera he had installed on his property. Glenn took the binders without comment, though the raised corner of his mouth signaled appreciation. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" Devin replied without smiling. "When they come for your house, there's no halfway." Glenn's legal assistant, Cora, handed Devin a cup of coffee while pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Here's what the bank submitted so far. Partial compliance with the judge's order." Inside were printouts of the original loan application, multiple signatures under the name Karen Jacoby, tax return copies, and a residency confirmation form, one listing Devin's address, notarized by a name. They didn't recognize, and the other signed off by a private agency registered to a holding company in Colorado. "None of this should have passed a basic check," Glenn said, "but they relied on automation. They assume people don't fight this stuff." The more they read, the worse it looked. The loan had been greenlit within 48 hours of submission, an unusually fast turnaround even for high-risk applications. The appraisal used in the documents listed Devin's house as a multi-tenant investment property, citing an accessory dwelling unit, ADU, that didn't exist. It was a full fabrication, yet no one had flagged it. The system had pushed it through like a parcel on a conveyor belt. Glenn leaned back, tapping the page with a pen. They never planned to collect on this loan. The person behind this didn't care about paying it. This was meant to be repackaged and resold, probably multiple times. You were just collateral dressed up in numbers. Devin looked at the signature page. Karen Jacoby's name was written in clean, slightly loopy handwriting. The notary seal was blurry but intact. The signature date was the same week Devin had been out of town buying supplies. That coincidence didn't sit right. "They signed the paperwork while I wasn't home," he muttered. "Someone was waiting." Glenn nodded. "We need to look further upstream. If this was premeditated, someone watched this property before you bought it, or right after. They may have flagged it as vulnerable." No mortgage, no noise, no paper trail beyond the county deed. Cora added, "We pulled the records on Jacoby LLC. It was formed 9 months ago in Delaware, with a listed agent that handles hundreds of companies. No real office, no employees. Just a paper trail designed to vanish when needed." Devin sat forward. "So what now? We got the injunction. You have the documents. What's next?" Glenn's answer was immediate. "We go public, legally. Not press, not TV. We file formal fraud notices to the Mortgage Aggregators Compliance Division, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the State Attorney General. Once those are in motion, we can refer your case as a test flag, an example that they're being watched." Devin considered that. It wasn't revenge, it was exposure. That afternoon, Glenn filed 3 formal complaints, each one referencing the court injunction, the forged notary, the fraudulent property classification, and the Shell LLC's involvement in securing a misrepresented loan. The bank's compliance department would be forced to open an internal case. If they didn't, Glenn would elevate it federally. That night, as Devin sat outside watching the sun burn down the edge of the horizon, a thought occurred to him that hadn't surfaced before. They were winning, slowly. But whoever was behind this had gone silent. No more cars, no more letters. No more attempts to provoke or confuse. That silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like recalibration. He pulled out his notebook and made a list titled Unfinished Business. At the top, who filed the notary, followed by why target this address, and where did the money from the loan actually go. Glenn had already warned him that answers like that could take months or never come at all. But Devin didn't care about timelines. He cared about accountability, and someone, somewhere, had held a pen and chosen his life as a tool in their profit scheme. That person wasn't invisible, just careful. As the breeze picked up and the desert night cooled around him, Devin poured a second cup of coffee and went back to reading the appraisal report one more time, not because he expected to find a new clue, but because he wanted to burn every detail into memory. When people steal from you on paper, they think the damage isn't real. They think the silence between pages is a buffer from consequences. Devin planned to be the voice that broke that silence, one document at a time. The first sign that things weren't over came just before sunrise, 2 days after Glenn filed the complaints to the financial regulators and state authorities. Devin had gotten up early, as usual, brewed his coffee, and stepped out onto the front porch expecting quiet. But what greeted him instead was the sight of his trash cans turned sideways, their contents neatly emptied in a perfect spread across the driveway. Coffee grounds, food packaging, even shredded mail, as if someone had gone through them deliberately and with care, but also with the confidence that no one would stop them. It wasn't just vandalism, it was surgical. Someone had rifled through his private refuse not in a fit of rage, but with precision, like they were looking for something. Devin stood motionless, letting the steam rise from his mug while he scanned the street, then the side yard, and then the gravel road leading to the utility easement behind the fence. No vehicles, no fresh tracks in the dirt, no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass or broken locks. Just a subtle reminder. They still had access. He took pictures of the scene from multiple angles, cleaned everything up with a pair of gloves, bagged the shredded documents into a separate bin, and locked both trash cans inside his garage. Then he went inside and turned off the porch light, reset the cameras, and sat down at his desk, not in fear, but in a state of cold evaluation. There was a method to this madness. The people behind the loan fraud hadn't gone quiet because they were retreating. They were regrouping, watching, calibrating their next move. And now that the court had frozen the process and the regulators were involved, Devin suspected they'd shift tactics from passive pressure to something more deliberate and riskier. That afternoon, Glenn called to confirm what Devin had already anticipated. The State Compliance Division acknowledged the complaint, Glenn said. They want to see all the paper, not just what we sent to the judge. And here's the real kicker. They're asking for your permission to contact the bank directly. That tells me they're taking it seriously. But it also means someone inside that bank is probably scrubbing hard to bury anything that connects them to this originator. Devin replied, Then I hope they scrub loud enough to trip an alarm. The next step came not from the regulators, but from a name Devin hadn't seen before, Anders & Franklin Asset Management. A letter arrived, this time sent by certified mail, which meant it required a signature. Devin took the envelope from the carrier and opened it right there at the door. The language was vague but ominous. A notice of third-party interest review regarding potential acquisition restructuring. It referenced his parcel number and listed him as the resident of record, not the owner, which set off every internal alarm bell. Devin scanned the header. Anders & Franklin was not the lender, not the aggregator, not even a subsidiary of the holding company attached to the original fraudulent loan. It was a completely separate financial entity, one known in real estate circles for acquiring distressed assets and repackaging them for hedge-backed portfolios. They were vultures, and they had caught the scent. Devin immediately forwarded the letter to Glenn, who responded within an hour. "This is bad. They're trying to transfer the paper, even under injunction. I'll motion for contempt if we can prove it. But this means the original creditor has decided to dump the risk and pass it to someone with deeper pockets and less shame. We need to make sure the court is aware. Now." Devin could feel the shift in tone. Glenn, always measured, now sounded strained. Not in panic, but in that way professionals do when they recognize the escalation of stakes beyond pure legality. Devin said, "Then I want to be in that courtroom when you file." Glenn didn't argue. 2 days later, they stood before the same judge, this time with heavier binders and thicker exhibits. Glenn laid out the pattern. A fraudulent loan filed under false residency, backed by falsified documents, currently under regulatory review, and now being sold on the secondary market to a company known for asset stripping. "This is no longer a question of mistaken paperwork," Glenn said. "This is predatory laundering of real property through layered shell companies, and Mr. McRae is the target of that pipeline. If your injunction is violated by this transfer, we're no longer dealing with fraud. We're dealing with conspiracy." The judge didn't respond immediately. He leafed through the packet, stopping at the notary signature page. "You say this notary is untraceable?" Glenn nodded. "We've run the registry. The name doesn't appear in the state's notary database. We've also submitted a separate complaint to the Secretary of State's office regarding falsified seals." The judge finally looked up. "Motion granted. Any attempt to transfer or sell the note in question will be treated as contempt of court. I want written confirmation from the bank by end of week that no transfer has occurred or is in process." It was a win, but it felt more like dodging a bullet than ending the fight. Outside the courthouse, Devin told Glenn, "They're not going to stop unless something scares them." Glenn replied, "Not unless the money becomes more dangerous to hold than to lose." That same evening, a different kind of problem emerged. Devin received an email from the county's tax assessment division, stating that a new tenant record had been added to his address in the occupancy database. It didn't affect ownership, but it flagged the property as multi-tenant, which would eventually trigger an increase in valuation for tax purposes unless challenged. Devin printed the email, grabbed his keys, and drove to the county office first thing the next morning. Inside, he asked for the records department and requested a face-to-face review. The clerk behind the desk raised her eyebrows but complied. After pulling up the record, she tilted the screen to show him. Sure enough, under occupancy status, there was now an attached line labeled Secondary Tenant, Jacoby. Devin asked, "When was this added?" The clerk squinted. "Looks like 3 days ago." "By whom?" "Third-party data pull. We get updates from external sources who monitor housing status." Devin knew exactly what that meant. Whoever was orchestrating the fraud had used a data broker to inject false tenant data into the municipal system, another move in a larger campaign to establish Karen Jacoby as someone with legal ties to his property. Devin filed an immediate correction request and a formal fraud alert on the record. He demanded that all future updates be frozen unless verified in person with identification. The clerk seemed both impressed and concerned. "You'd be surprised how rarely people even catch this kind of thing," she said. Devin replied, "You'd be surprised how hard someone will work to steal your house when they think you'll never see it coming." Glenn filed another complaint with the court that same afternoon, attaching the tax records update as evidence of coordinated data manipulation. He also sent copies to the federal agencies already monitoring the case. The next escalation, however, came from an unexpected angle: Devin's insurance provider. Out of nowhere, he received a notice that his homeowner's insurance was being reevaluated due to recent property classification changes. The reclassification could increase his premiums by 65%, and in some scenarios, even cause policy cancellation due to occupancy irregularities. Glenn stared at the letter and muttered, "They're trying to force a domino effect. If they can make you lose your coverage, they can argue that the house is a distressed asset, which opens the door to secondary acquisition again. These people are building a legal minefield." Devin didn't hesitate. He called the insurance office, demanded an in-person meeting with the underwriter, and brought every legal document from the injunction to the fraud complaint. He laid it all out in front of a very startled manager and calmly said, "You are either part of this, or you're being used. Either way, you're not raising a damn thing without a fight." The manager backed off, requested a freeze pending review, and Devin left knowing the message had been sent. He wasn't going to be steamrolled quietly. Back at home, Devin did something he hadn't done since the beginning of the mess. He sat down and called his sister. He hadn't told her anything up to this point, figuring it was better to keep the burden to himself. But now, with every institution around him either manipulated or complicit, he needed someone to hear it from his own mouth. She didn't say much at first, just listened, and when he finished, she asked one thing. "What do you need?" Devin answered honestly, "I just need to finish this. I need to see it through." And then he hung up, poured a drink, and sat by the window watching the desert breathe in darkness. He wasn't broken. He wasn't scared. But he was burning. And someone, somewhere, was going to learn what it meant to steal from a man who had nothing left to lose but everything he'd built with his own hands. The moment Glenn received confirmation from the court that a contempt warning had been served to Anderson Franklin Asset Management, the entire tone of the case shifted. It was no longer about stalling a fraudulent foreclosure or untangling the false documents that had been stapled together with manufactured names and meaningless shell companies. Now it was a live legal threat with teeth, and for the first time Devin sensed they'd struck a nerve. That nerve exposed itself 2 days later, when a plain white SUV pulled into Devin's driveway and a man in a tailored Navy suit stepped out with a slim briefcase and a thick folder. Devin didn't come to the door immediately. He watched through the curtain, took 2 photographs of the man and the license plate, then unlocked the door slowly, making sure his phone was already recording audio in his shirt pocket. The man introduced himself as Andrew Feldman, acting on behalf of an interested investment entity, and claimed he was there to discuss a non-confrontational resolution regarding the asset confusion at Echo Ridge Road. Devin didn't blink. He didn't invite him in. He simply said, "This property isn't an asset. It's my home. There's no confusion. You people invented one." Feldman remained calm, spoke with rehearsed politeness, and then opened the folder. Inside were 3 documents. One was a contract for voluntary quitclaim transfer of Devin's property to a Delaware-based holding company. One was a non-disclosure agreement, and the last was a payment offer, a single-page check stub reflecting an amount of $150,000 made out to Devin McRae. "We understand this has been stressful," Feldman said. "We're willing to provide a clean closure with financial compensation and no liability exposure on your end. If you sign today, all activity regarding the disputed loan and foreclosure process will cease permanently." Devin looked down at the check and then directly into the man's eyes. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice low but precise. "You walked onto my land with a payoff offer and a paper trail that implicates you in fraud, wire fraud, attempted theft of real property, and conspiracy to launder a title through shell entities. And you thought I'd take a check?" Feldman's polite expression didn't change, but his lips pressed into a thinner line. "This is a final offer," he said. Devin reached out, closed the folder, and handed it back. "Good. Then we're done." He shut the door. 30 minutes later, he was at Glenn's office with a printout of the audio transcript and the 2 photographs. Glenn's response was immediate. "This is your leverage. They just offered you hush money to walk away from a stolen identity case tied to property fraud, after a court injunction. That's a federal crime. They may not know it yet, but we're sitting on a live wire now." Glenn contacted the Assistant Attorney General's office and submitted a referral packet under the Whistleblower Fraud Program, naming all the known corporate entities and attaching the quitclaim offer and check copy as evidence of attempted coercion. Devin wasn't looking for money anymore. He wanted them buried. Over the next 72 hours, Glenn worked around the clock. He subpoenaed internal communications between the bank and the aggregator, sent a second filing to the state AG attaching the NDA as an obstruction attempt, and requested court permission to depose 3 individuals tied to the loan processing phase. The judge granted limited discovery, and suddenly the corporate silence that had dominated for weeks broke. The bank's legal counsel called Glenn's office directly, not to negotiate, but to ask whether Devin would consider private arbitration. "They're scared," Glenn told Devin. "They're trying to keep this out of court before your house becomes the case they build legislation around." Devin shook his head. No arbitration. No silence. Meanwhile, the regulators were moving faster than expected. One of the state investigators called Glenn and said their internal audit found 4 more properties flagged under the same LLC as Devin's, 3 of which were also under dispute for questionable loans. 2 had already gone to foreclosure and been resold. That detail hit Devin harder than expected. Not because it made his situation worse, but because it confirmed what he had already feared. He wasn't the only target. He had just caught them before the machine finished chewing. With that revelation, Glenn doubled down. He pushed for a public hearing on the court docket, not sealed, not closed, and filed an emergency injunction to block not just Devin's foreclosure, but the legal operation of the LLCs in question within the state's jurisdiction. That motion sent ripples. It made the case visible in legal circles, and soon other attorneys began calling Glenn's office asking for details. Devin didn't care about headlines. He cared about making sure the next person down the line didn't have to install cameras and freeze their credit just to keep their damn house. A week later, the judge called both parties into chambers and issued a preliminary ruling. The loan against Devin's property was to be nullified under fraud. All claims to ownership interest by Jacoby, LLC, or any affiliated entity were void. The court recognized the transaction as malicious in nature, manufactured by deliberate misrepresentation, and ruled that any attempt to enforce the agreement or transfer the paper would be treated as a criminal offense. But the real strike came 2 days later, when Devin received confirmation that the Attorney General had opened a formal investigation into Anders and Franklin and its affiliates for coordinated real estate fraud. The quitclaim document and the check had been submitted as primary exhibits. When Devin read that notice, he didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just set the letter down on his kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Not out of shock, but because he knew what it had cost to get there. Months of pressure, of false accusations, of strategic intimidation wrapped in polite threats. He had won the fight. But more importantly, he had made the people responsible answer for it, and they hadn't expected that. 6 weeks after the court voided the fraudulent loan and the Attorney General launched a formal investigation into Anders and Franklin and its partner entities, Devin finally began to feel something that resembled stillness. It wasn't peace, not quite. He wasn't naive enough to think that any legal victory could undo the months of anxiety, surveillance, and psychological erosion, but it was a kind of breath he hadn't taken in a long time. The constant anticipation of the next threat had lifted, and in its place was a colder, clearer awareness. They had tried to steal everything he had, and they had failed. His home was intact. The title was clean. The fraudulent entities had been disqualified from operating within the state. His name had been cleared from every forged record, occupancy list, and mortgage register. It had taken layers of affidavits, court orders, notarized statements, and subpoenas just to untangle the lie they had spun in a matter of days. But it was done. The house, however, bore traces of what had happened. He had replaced the mailbox even though it still worked. He'd repainted the back fence, not because it needed it, but because that was where the photo had been taken. the one they'd used to fabricate the illusion of ownership. Every morning he passed by the motion cameras on his porch, he felt the faintest irritation, like walking past an old scar. He didn't remove them. Some things were just part of him now. Glenn's firm remained involved for several more weeks, mostly handling residual paperwork, responding to belated